The time is always right to start what is right. Dr. Martin Luther King said long time ago. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Morgan State University Research and Scholarship Series. This Research and Scholarship Series is organized by the School of Education and Urban Studies in collaboration with the Division of International Affairs and the Star Scholars Network. And today's session is more focused on global student mobility and faculty mobility in higher education. We run bi-weekly session like this on a wide range of educational topics related to research and publication, both for faculty and students. In a few minutes, our outstanding panelists and authors from Afghanistan to Poland, and all over the world of our recent book chapter will share their critical perspective on global student mobility, faculty mobility in higher education. They will also answer your questions and invite you to participate in a group discussion. The other thing, you will meet the winners of Morgan Global Footprint Essay Contest, one of the signature initiatives that documents the real stories and experience of international students and scholars here at our national treasure, Morgan State University. Later, I will also announce the current and upcoming research opportunities for both faculty and students. My name is Chris Nabista, Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Advanced Studies, Leadership and Policy at Morgan State University. I'm also the founding editor of Journal of International Student, one of the flagship journal in higher education. We have about 60 minutes ahead of us, and all of us will reflect on these important questions that you see on my screen, particularly in the context of ongoing geopolitical tensions among nations, pandemics, race of recruiting, global talents among institutions. The more we are educated, the more we are advanced in science and technology, the more we travel one part of the world to another, the further we are divided, the further we see the death, violence, inequalities, growing number of refugees, almost every day globally. As an educator, as a member of our society, we are rethinking, the value of importance of global student mobility to address, or in addressing these social structural issues and inequalities. I would like to, we would like to start the program with our Morgan Global Footprint initiatives, and I would like to invite Dr. Edel Newsonhorst, Professor of English at Morgan State University, to share about this project. Dr. Newsonhorst.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Morgan State University. So we're really excited about this project. We invited undergraduate and graduate students, as well as faculty, to submit narratives about their study or experiences outside of their home country. And we got some really amazing responses. Now, for the student entries, graduate and undergraduate, they'll receive cash prizes, as you see on the screen. For our faculty, they received our undying gratitude, and they'll also receive a copy of the book once it is published, and it's en route to being published as we speak. Not the entire essay, but I just want to share with you one of the undergraduate essays. Sure. From someone born here in the United States. And, we all love a good story. I mean, that is what marks our humanity. So this story is titled, My Adventure to Spain. When I was a sophomore at Hudson Catholic Regional High School, my school began promoting a new student exchange program. It was to a private Catholic school in Spain. Our school valued diversity, so our student population consisted of all racial groups, including Asians, African Americans, Caucasians, Hispanics. Hudson Catholic School had endless resources and opportunities, so we were given the chance to study education abroad. I was very excited since I had never traveled outside the country. I never even took an airplane. I've been on road trips to visit my distant family that live in the tri-state area, but that wasn't very far away, still very close to home. I was thrilled to be riding on a plane for the very first time. I had the opportunity to explore, try new things, and I would be surrounded by a different culture other than my own. My family and I were very excited to host a student for the first time. It was something I wanted to do since I was a kid. My mom and stepmom were stunned at first. We didn't live in the best part of the community, and my mom was gay, but that didn't matter to me. I wanted to give someone the same chance I had. When I told my brothers that a student, Zaira, would be staying with us, they all agreed. Oh boy, another girl living in a house. What a tragedy. They weren't as thrilled as me, but I was happy. I was the oldest and only girl out of 3 boys. Finally, I would have the chance to connect with someone my own age and gender. Growing up as the only girl was hard and rough, and being the oldest didn't make it much better. So that's simply the start of what is an amazing essay, the rest of which you can find in the book. Thank you, Dr. Vista.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciated being the part of this project. Cross-cultural experience are recognized as the engines leading to global awareness. In this project, both faculty and students were invited to write their narratives based on their overseas experience of studying or working at another institutions. And they share, each of these selected essays share a life-changing experience, rich story with the extraordinary details and some exciting wonders. The award committee rated and evaluated all the essays using our standard rubrics, and only the students' essays were recognized for the awards. Now it's my pleasure to announce the winner of the Morgan Global Footprint Essay Contest. The first place goes to David C. Miller. Congratulations. David is a doctoral student in social work, and he shared his study abroad experience in Cuba. The second place goes to Rachel Flo. Congratulations. Rachel is doctoral student in English. She shared her study abroad and teaching experience in Cape Town, South Africa. The third place goes to Ruth Okolo. Ruth is an international student from Nigeria pursuing a graduate degree in English at Morgan. The runner-up goes to Jennifer. Congratulations, Jennifer. She's an international doctoral student from Nigeria in the Department of English. And among the undergraduate essay, the first place goes to Efe Idu Doing. Ife is an international undergraduate student here in the Morgan, in the School of Computer, Mathematics, and Natural Science. The second place goes to Dara Shenar. Dara is undergraduate business student who wrote her study abroad experience in Belgium. And the third place goes to Rihanna King. Rihanna is an undergraduate student in elementary education who wrote her study abroad experience in Spain. And the runner-up goes to Abisola Arolaju. Abisola is an international student in a computer science from Nigeria. Congratulations to all winners. And now we are pleased to share, that we selected 41 essays from this particular project. And written by both our faculty colleagues and students. And all these, selected essays will be appearing in a book. Each of our authors, as Dr. Newsonhorst said earlier, will receive complimentary copies in a couple of months. Congratulations, you all. Now, it's time to introduce our distinguished speaker who have accepted our invitation to join this session despite their busy schedule and different times. And thank you. I request each speaker and authors to take a few minutes to introduce themselves and their recent book or the chapter. My colleagues, Dr. Dua Fraser, Dr. Fraser from Coppin State University is going to invite our speakers to speak about 3 minutes or so each. Dr. Fraser, over to you. We didn't hear you. I guess there was some technical issues. We have not heard you yet. We have a wide range of speakers who have, produced a lot of scholarship in the last, I would say 2 or 3 years that we have worked closely in our book series. I'd like to invite our special colleagues, Dr. Josh McCone from SUNY Oswego. He's the Associate Provost in International Education Program. Josh has co-edited a special volume, Global Higher Education During COVID-19. It's wonderful to have you here, Josh. Josh, over to you.
Great, thank you, Krista. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you, sir.
Good, it's a real pleasure to be here. So I don't have much time, but I appreciate the invitation from Dr. Nabista from Morgan State, and it's a pleasure meeting all of you. Briefly, my research is focused particularly on Chinese scholar mobility, and in greater detail, what I would call the recently suspicious environment in the United States. I looked at, for a recent article in the Journal of Contemporary China, at visiting scholars. In other words, someone who is here on an academic visa, but not a student. And I'd like to put a brief context that the United States, suffice to say, has always highly regulated this process. Those of us who work in the field of international student services, we ourselves are subject to US government criminal and other background investigation. US university presidents have to sign documents that they will adequately staff and fund the international student services operation. What our colleague Krista and Vishna and Alan have called talented yet seen with suspicion. I think it's fair to say that the US government has to some extent always treated individuals here on J1 visas as subjects of surveillance. But pertaining to China in particular, that suspicion has really accelerated, particularly during the last years of the Trump administration, to a level not seen towards any country from my perspective in at least a generation. I won't go into the long detail of the relationship between US and China, but suffice to say that the academic relationship, the bilateral academic relationship between the United States and China was instrumental in the opening of US-China relations since the 1970s. And that included faculty exchange, student exchange, and an acknowledgement by the US government at that time that STEM research in particular was of interest to China. So this has always been part of the relationship between the US and China. Briefly, in context, China prior to the pandemic was clear in a way the #1 sender to the United States of visiting scholars. It totaled 35% actually of all visiting scholars in the US. The second largest sender, India, only 10%. So China was the largest sender of scholars. And to be clear, many of those received state funding, and that may have heightened the suspicion. I'd like to share that most of us have some of us may be aware of the so-called China Initiative, which was undertaken by the Trump administration, which focused on high-profile yet largely unsubstantiated investigations of researchers with Chinese ties on the belief that they were essentially non-traditional collectors of intelligence. Other things went on as well, closing of Confucius Institutes, what I would call a chilling effect. And this was pre-COVID. This was beginning. By the time COVID arrived, I think we all remember there was in many sectors kind of a blame China offensive in many things, and it affected higher education as well. Something which our colleague Jenny Lee has referred to as neo-racism, in that such behavior against Chinese people was somehow acceptable in a way that it would not be towards others. So from my research, the overall atmosphere of academic exchange, including with visiting scholars between the US and China, had suffered greatly. Now, to conclude my opening remarks here, post-COVID, what's interesting to point out is that the number of Chinese scholars in the United States really has not rebounded to the level that other countries have. I won't get into the data on that. Of course, it's still rather raw coming out of COVID. The number of Chinese students in the US is still roughly the same proportion as it was pre-COVID, but the number of scholars has not, and other countries have sent more. So what we're seeing is that the number of scholars from China has dropped precipitously and has not yet rebounded. From my own research, I can share that the reasons that Chinese scholars have to come to the United States, again, this was published in the Journal of Contemporary China last year, the reasons they cite are entirely normal. They are entirely typical of academic researchers, largely to learn English, to gain a cultural experience, to advance their own personal and professional agendas, regardless of any funding source they have or stated policy their governments may have. So I'll conclude these brief remarks and then welcome questions later, that what began really as a goodwill, positive people-to-people exchange between the US and China in the higher education sector since the late 1970s, which was also part, frankly, of bilateral foreign policy relations between the two countries, has diminished. And it remains to be seen what the long-term effect of this situation is. The China initiative may have officially been discontinued under the Biden administration. However, much of what I would consider the implicit bargain that was made between the US and China 40 years ago, much of that suspicion remains. The implications for that run deep, and it seems to me that overall US-China bilateral relations, as well as academic relations, are very much in question at this time.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fraser, let's check the microphone with you. Lynn, you have published a wonderful chapter in the book, Remaining Mobility in Higher Education. So says all the way from University of Regina, Canada. Lynn, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Krishna. Thank you for having me today. My chapter actually is focused on the Chinese married female international students, the special group, and just about their perceptions of the gender-based and culture-based challenges. So, strong gender codes and the performative roles are embedded in Chinese culture. So for thousands of years, Chinese women have not had independent personalities and social statuses or access to education. So since the reform at the opening up of Chinese society, many things have changed. China just has not become the largest single source of international students studying in the US, Canada, or other Western countries. So Chinese females, married or single, just comprise part of this international students group. So however, the married Chinese female international students, have to face multiple challenges with the cross-culture adjustment, gender-based stereotypes from China, the host countries, and their families, like marital status and parental status. So this chapter just specifically investigates married Chinese female international students, the perceptions of their needs, and during their study at a Canadian university and their coping strategies. So feminist standpoint theories as a theoretical framework is employed to delve into their recognition of the roles of social, historical location in shaping their identities and perceptions. So a feminist phenomenological inquiry is utilized to guide the research. In-depth interviews with the participants identify the specific contributions as well as insights gained from their experience. So I think this study just covers gaps in the areas of the motivation, knowledge, and organizational barriers in maritime female international students' experience. So also, I just offered some specific recommendations, just like cross-cultural empathy, culturally sensitive counseling and caring clubs, and flexible schedule of learning, something like that, just creating a more inclusive environment for them. Yeah, that's everything I just want to present. Thank you,
Lynn.
Krishna. Okay.
Yes, for another brief remarks, let me invite our next colleagues here. You can see here Jamie and Bill from Goucher College. They have also wonderful, let's go for the brief remarks, and after the brief remarks, of all the presenters, we'll have a group discussion. Okay, Jamie and Bill.
Wonderful. Thanks for having us. So Jamie and I are at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland, which was the first college in the United States to require a study abroad component for 100% of our undergraduates. And so as a result, we knew that our student body was going to be significantly impacted by COVID-19. Not only the portion of our student body that was out of the country when the pandemic struck and had to make that choice when and how to return home, but also those that were in the process of planning or had already planned future study abroad in the coming months of the pandemic. And in additionally, all students, right, who had this dimension of global education as a cornerstone of their undergraduate experience. And so we're really interested in seeing what this type of disruption of this sort of fundamental cornerstone activity of an undergraduate education, how students made sense and processed that. And so we ran a series of a survey and focus groups of those students impacted during the summer of 2020, and basically thought about three groups of students. The students that were currently abroad and out of the country at this onset of the pandemic that had to make that decision about when and how to come home. Students who were forced to cancel plans either in the summer or fall of 2020, and students that had not yet made plans, but were about to make plans knowing that this was a requirement of graduation for them. So we identified 574 likely students that were impacted on our campus and had 193 of them complete our survey. It's about a little over 13% of our entire undergraduate population, just for an idea of scale. And then in addition to that, we had 10 students do in-depth focus groups with us about their experiences and their processing of that. So one important piece of context for this before I turn it over to my colleague to talk about some of our findings is that when we were actually talking to these students, we were, as tough as it is to believe, at a particularly kind of optimistic time in the pandemic. We spoke with them in sort of late June, mid-July 2020. And that's actually, if you can remember back that far, right at a kind of a lull. And many of our students, as we spoke with them, had a reasonable expectation that they would be back on campus that coming fall and spring, and that study abroad may have very well been possible in the 2020-2021 academic year, when in reality, at least our students spent the entire academic year online. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague to talk about some of our findings.
Okay, so just to highlight two key findings quickly, looking at the impact of COVID on students' attitudes towards the study abroad requirement at Goucher, and also on their desire to participate in other international activities. So in terms of the impact on attitudes towards our requirement, students who were merely observers, meaning that they weren't abroad during spring 2020 or did not have plans that needed to be modified, experienced the least change in their opinion. Regardless of the type of impact experienced, though, similar proportions of respondents became more in favor of the requirement. And then finally, for that piece, respondents who were impacted directly became somewhat less in favor or a great deal less in favor of our institutional requirement. And then in terms of the impact on the desire to participate in other international activities such as travel, work, or schooling, the majority of students reported that COVID-19 had no impact. Across all categories of future international activities, sophomores experienced the largest declines in their desires to participate, while seniors experienced the largest increases. And we think this impact could be a result of seniors being the group most likely to have been abroad during spring 2020 and called back early. As such, they've had an increased exposure to concrete international experiences they could draw on. And alternatively, for many sophomores, these international experiences were still hypothetical. So we're happy to talk in more depth during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy and Bill. Appreciate it. Yes, and this is
Dr. Bista, can you hear
we
me?
can hear you now. Welcome.
Okay.
Yes.
Greetings to everyone. Thank you, Drs. Mulaney and Harder, for sharing your study. To join you. Pleased to introduce Dr. Aliya Kuzabekova from Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan, and she will present her experience with the publication of the experiences of international faculty and institutions of higher education.
Hello, nice to see everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the chapter the chapter that I wrote was on the experiences of international faculty on campus of Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And to briefly explain you what the university is, it's an autonomous institution, meaning autonomous, independent from the Ministry of Education, which has full funding from the government of Kazakhstan, which has been established in partnership with some leading top universities in the world, such as Cambridge, University of Pennsylvania, Lee Kuan Yew University in Singapore, and a couple of others, and which is also importantly a residential campus university, so that all students and faculty members who attend the university live on campus. Almost all students, but definitely all faculty members, they live on campus of the university. And it has, it's an international research university aspiring to become the world-class university. At the same time, having the mission of serving as a flagship of educational research, of educational reform in the country. So in a sense, this university had some unique challenges which were associated with the fact that it's an international university. And it's international in a sense that over 90% of faculty members working at the institution are hired from abroad. At the same time, it services mostly domestic students, and it has English as the main language of instruction. So some of the unique challenges that the institution faces in general, regardless of the COVID era, is that it services mostly non-native speakers of English who never had a chance to go abroad and they are educated in the country. It has a high level of plagiarism due to the sort of a plagiarism culture in the country. Most of the university in general and students at the university have little experience with distance education. It has a somewhat high level of bureaucracy compared with other research universities because it's funded by the government. On Nazarbayev University and government, given the money that the university receives. And finally, one of the main unique features is that it doesn't have the institution of tenure. And as a result, it has somewhat lower level of institutional commitment from the international faculty members. So what I did to understand the situation and the experiences of international faculty during the COVID-19 pandemic, that I conducted a mixed method exploratory study using surveys of the faculty members as well as some qualitative interviews. And so the main findings that I found is that it should be clear from the survey and from the interviews, in many ways, expatriate faculty experience many similar challenges in their teaching, research, and service, and had many worries typical for domestic and international faculty at established research universities in the West. They had to quickly transition to online teaching, provide more academic and psychological support to their students, deal with the effects of constrained mobility and inability to access university facilities on research, deal with the complexities of Zoom communication in service, worry about the financial impacts of COVID-19 on their universities and consequently their salary and contracts, and do this while dealing with disease, death of relatives, and homeschooled children. However, at NU, these challenges were somewhat more complex. Non-native speaking students required an unusual level of support online, as well as extra effort in developing innovative instructional and assessment approaches due to plagiarism. In addition, the students had to be supported with a high amount of advising because they had to go back to live with their parents who had little understanding of the students' experiences at the international university being educated in Kazakhstan themselves. These struggles reveal a potential issue with the overall model of the international university in Kazakhstan. The university's instructional model was based on predominantly face-to-face instruction and academic support provided on a fully residential campus. Such a high residence model was created on purpose to allow full immersion of students into the atmosphere of a Western-style world-class university and to create ideal conditions conducive to learning and intellectual exchange. Distance education was apparently not taken seriously by the institution, given the reported absence of professional instructional technology and online teaching support. As a result, the university was not well prepared to deal with the challenges of transferring institution online during COVID-19, and the faculty experienced extra challenges in dealing with pandemic teaching. Second, the faculty members at the International University reported more struggles with research. They think that they were provided with extremely high, but at the same time, somewhat unclear research performance indicators for the post-COVID-19 stage. This caused much anxiety in relation to research. Prior experiences with administration changing performance evaluation indicators on the fly and after the fact, which affected contract renewals and promotion decisions, made faculty exert self-pressure to be productive in research, especially given the absence of tenure at the university. These faculty perceptions reveal another important problem with the model of the international university in Kazakhstan: the excessive bureaucratic control, which is omnipresent at the institution both internally and externally. The pandemic has uncovered the main weakness of the bureaucratic university: its inability to quickly adapt to changes and its predisposition to become ambiguous when standard operating procedures fail, with subsequent negative effects on the employee productivity and satisfaction. Third, the work in the situation of global health emergencies was also more stressful for international faculty due to the fact that they were stuck abroad, could not rely on the emotional and physical support from their relatives, and could not provide such support to their family in the home country. These stresses affected the ability of the faculty to focus on their work and to balance their work and family life. The findings from the study raise some interesting questions about the future of international research universities, which have been established recently in many non-Western contexts. In the context where distance education is becoming a new norm, and as a result of the pandemic isolation, how will such international universities reconceptualize the educational product and model to be able to compete with the expansion of distance education offerings from the West? Will domestic students be willing to travel to a Cambridge-like university at their home when Cambridge would be willing to come to the convenience of their homes online? Moreover, can world-class universities be now reconceptualized as a university teaching predominantly online? How open will governments in non-Western countries be to funding locally created international universities teaching completely or predominantly online? And will it be even possible for non-Western online world-class universities to emerge if Western universities have a first-comer advantage? So these are some brief insights, and I'm willing to answer your questions during the discussion session.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your valuable research with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Eric Biker from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte in the USA. And his publication is Critical Perspectives on Equity and Social Mobility in Study Abroad. And I'd like to remind all speakers that to leave your remarks for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser, Dr. Nabista, to Morgan State University for hosting. This is a great webinar, awesome opportunity to get together as a global community. So thank you so much for making this possible. So my chapter was written with two of my colleagues at UNC Charlotte. And like other chapters or folks who have talked about here, we actually wrote this prior to COVID-19. And then As we all came back from short-term study abroad programs or leading the study abroad programs, my colleagues and I wanted to put something together to reflect that. And of course, COVID-19 has changed some of that. So in my remarks, I'm going to keep them brief, but I want to talk a little bit about how going forward, we could adapt this same model with more kind of a virtual exchange and COIL or globally networked learning. So our chapter is called The Study Abroad Diamond, examining facets of supporting student mobility. We examined our 3 study abroad programs that we lead. One was to Germany, another was to South Africa, and another was to Spain. Each one of them were different time lengths, but all kind of had the qualities of a short-term type of study abroad program. We found that there was a growth, even in the short-term study abroad, growth in our students, our participants who were mostly all teacher candidates, growth in their intercultural awareness and communication. We found that the travel was one of the strongest ways to get to know a place and cultural group, which shouldn't be surprising, as well as we found that our participants developed a more refined understanding of what does it mean to global citizen, as well as developing some global competencies. So with that, we also put together a model called the Study Abroad Diamond to be able to explain what makes for successful study abroad experiences. It's not just something that is can happen overnight, as we all know, but the student experiences are often what shines the brightest, the top facet of the diamond, but it's strengthened, of course, by the programming, the mission of your university, and also the kind of systems you have in place, international systems, networks, etc. So now during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been, of course, many barriers and challenges. There are some opportunities as well. And one of the things that we discuss, taking a critical approach in this chapter, is that study abroad can be great for some, but it also can be sort of a passport of privilege. And that's a real issue. It's an equity issue. And virtual exchange, like the COIL projects or GNL, Globally Networked Learning projects, I happen to be leading 2 this semester, one in Germany, one with Kazakhstan. They provide more sort of equitable opportunities. Nothing can replace sort of being in country and that study abroad, but there are now more of my students, teacher candidates. I have one class of 25 that's engaged with a project in Germany, another group of 12 students who are engaged in Kazakhstan, who most likely there would have been a very small fraction of those students who could actually go on study abroad. So there are some opportunities now with virtual exchange to allow for what I call virtual student mobility and to engage in international experiences. And I look forward to our discussion time where we can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Biker, for sharing your research and experiences with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Maiki Kato from Nagoya University in Japan. And they will discuss the publication, Critical Perspectives on Equity and Social Mobility in Study Abroad. And please try to keep remarks for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Maki from Nagoya University. First of all, thank you for having me today. The title of my chapter is Effects of Study Abroad on the Career, the case of graduates from a Japanese university. And actually, before writing this chapter, my colleague and I had analyzed the effect of short-term study abroad on the career of graduates with random sampling data to control the selection bias, which you guys know it's still quite big. So what I want to clarify in this chapter was a mechanism. how the effects of study abroad relate to educational outcomes as several competencies, including generic competencies like soft skills, subject-specific competencies or international competencies. Then career, including income and more subjective evaluation as leadership roles, reading habits to career, and adding value to society. The data was collected through the online survey in 2018 academic year for social science graduates of one Japanese university. The number of respondents was 1,271, and response rate was around 35%. And we thought it was not so bad. And among those respondents, around 20% had study abroad experience, including shorter one and longer one. And with empirical analysis like structural equation modeling or path analysis, I concluded that SA enhanced the career, study abroad enhanced the career through human capital accumulation. The significance of the analysis is, I think, two. First one, treating study abroad as a part of wider experience of higher education and showing the possible path from study abroad to educational output, and then to career. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kato, for sharing your research with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Kung from the University of Florida in the USA. And he will discuss his publication, Critical Perspectives on Equity and Social Mobility in Study Abroad. Please keep your remarks for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to meet and hear from such experts in our field. So one of my recent studies was on Chinese doctoral students in the US and UK and what they feel is necessary to find a job. So I worked on this with Dr. Zhao, who is also here today, and she'll be speaking later on another of our projects. So lately, what we found is, even though there is increased research on international students, there wasn't too much specifically on doctoral students, student mobility, and employment. And then considering how important our international students are, we wanted to find out more and what we can do to help our students find employment. So students typically, they pursue their degree for a variety of reasons, but ultimately the students, what they want to do is to find a good job. So specifically, we investigated how international Chinese students view the differences between employers in Western countries and China, what they needed to prepare to join the labor force, what factors influence a Chinese student's career after graduation, and then finally, how they view career services and support at their university. So after analyzing some focus group data, we found several themes. So first, the participants' views towards jobs were heavily influenced by whether they were interested in looking for jobs in industry versus academia, and whether they were looking for jobs in China and elsewhere. So additionally, the value of the PhD was often brought up, and then the participants said that, for instance, the PhD is much more valued in the US and Western cultures, and not so much as in China because it's so popular and common in China. We also found that the employers and the work environments in the China versus the West were very different. So for instance, what they said was the PhD was much more important in Western countries, and the employers there, what they tended to do was to focus on skills that fit and the potential value that candidates could bring to the organization. While in China, the PhD, what employers would look for would be the qualifications and achievements and maybe number of publications. And then finally, a final theme that we found was just regarding career resources and channels. So many universities, they have resources, although the participants admitted to not being too familiar and not really taking advantage of it. So in sum, with internationalization still occurring, It's very important for universities and employers to be aware of this trend, and they should strive to provide necessary resources to assist these international students throughout this process. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kang, for sharing your research with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Anakshi Sengupta from the American University of Afghanistan, and he will present his chapter, Mobility of Muslim Students Working Higher Education, a Dream Fraught with Challenges. Thank you so much for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Dr. Nabista and Dr. Fraser. Although I am from American University of Afghanistan, but unfortunately, both our campus is under the control of Taliban. So we are all operating from our home countries. So this chapter that I wrote was about mobility of Muslim students and Islamophobia. And this was with Dr. Sumair from American University of Iraq, Soleimani, and Dr. Andrew Semawanga from St. Lawrence University of Uganda. So we were basically trying to find out, the fear that the Muslim students face while they apply to go and study abroad. So we had, in the literature review, of course, we found about the push and the pull factors, because at this time, when I wrote this, there was a surge of Muslim students coming from the Middle Eastern country, mainly from Syria, Iraq, and other places. We had 2 types of students that we studied. One who intends to go and study abroad, and those who have studied abroad and have come back home. So the number of participants were, of course, quite high from Iraq. Kurdistan is basically where we had based our research. Uganda, the number of Muslim students are less, but nevertheless, there were some students from there. It was difficult to trace the students who have come back home or have stayed back in the country of where they have gone to study, mainly USA and European countries, UK. But the students who were wanting to apply and was applying in a large number, I would say, they had a certain fear, about the study abroad, mainly the apprehension of, within quotes, othering by the universities, visa issuing, deportation of students, and also whether they would be allowed to practice their religion, their culture, or their particular dressing style. So, but the pull factors were quite prevalent of having a foreign degree, back home or staying back and getting a better job over there. And while I was writing this chapter, I didn't know that today most of our students, we have evacuated around 350 students and to different countries. And we are now in the process of evacuating another 350 who's stuck in Kabul, Afghanistan. So the relevance of this study at that point, it seems it's very prevalent now, because all our students are facing the same issues, whether they're going to get visa coming from Afghanistan and what kind of life lies ahead of them. So that's all about my study. Thank you so much for having me here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we'd like to introduce Giorgio Marinani, who is from International Association of Universities, France, and he will present his chapter, Global Collaboration for Global Solution in Academia, Opportunities and Challenges. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you very much. So when we wrote our chapter, me and my colleague Katarina Minaeva, we were looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting global cooperation. And what we saw also through a survey that we conducted at that time was that the COVID-19 pandemic was increasing inequality and amplifying existing inequalities in the world, and it was challenging global cooperation. And we saw a quite difference between let's say, more developed country, more industrialized country, especially in terms of research, for instance, in terms of development of vaccine, in terms of distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. And what we saw more, let's say, a multiplication of efforts and creation of different type of research, but completely disconnected, so less cooperation at global level. And we were pointing out that this is not the way forward, because we are trying to build up, as International Association University, a real global community of higher education institution. And what the COVID-19 show is that global challenges need global solution, and it's not through national or a group of national efforts that problems will be solved for everybody. So the inequality problem is clearly the major one, which was evident from our research. And since then, the situation is even worse. If we see, I mean, for my co-writer is from Russia, okay? And from now on, the cooperation, because of geopolitical factors, is getting more complicated. So what we are seeing now is that governments are imposing more and more rules on higher education institutions with whom they should collaborate. And that's a trend that is threatening academic freedom and university independence. So we are seeing that global cooperation is needed now more than ever, and in the future we still have to work more at a global level in order to find solutions for global challenges.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marinani, for sharing your important chapter with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Metris Harris-Weidman from Lancaster University in the UK. And they will discuss It Takes a Village, Holistic Emancipatory Framework for Students of Color in Study Abroad. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you. First, let me just say it is a real honor to be amongst you all. Just everybody's chapters and the information that they're giving me is just really key and very important. Second, Dr. Nabista, I so appreciate everything that you've done to bring us all together. So for my chapter, I wanted to give you just a slight background. I'm basically working on my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation at Lancaster University in Education and Social Justice. But my background, I'm actually a therapist. And somehow my first love is psychology and my passion is study abroad. So the framework I created is basically to help educators engage holistically with underrepresented or marginalized students. Okay. While I was doing my research, my literature review, I kept coming across a very deficit-oriented approach to looking at students of color. And I felt like the real story wasn't being told. So in so doing that and looking at HBCUs, which are historically Black colleges and universities, I felt like they embodied some of the village style approach that is very much a part of my framework. So I'll just skip to the framework because of the time problem. So my framework is called Mensch, which in German is a word that means human. It can also mean a person of integrity and honor. So my thought is that we need something that will help educators engage with students in such a way that we get a fuller picture of who they are and what their needs are when they study abroad. I don't know if many of you know, but students of color are frequently underrepresented in study abroad. And so for me, one of my goals as a former study abroad student is to get more people out there. So Mensch, M, that means multiple consciousness. And that is, it's basically exploring whether students self-identify with plural identities. So it's understanding that students of color are not a monolithic group and they're not limited to one identity. The other is the exploration, E, exploration of the identity intersections and the potential impact on study abroad experience that those identities might have. So that might be, what might it be like to study abroad in France if you identify with being Black and gay? And how might you be prepared for that in advance? Name, which is highlighting the power structures relevant to students' study abroad experiences before, during, and following their study abroad experiences. So who are the gatekeepers? Who allocates scholarship funds? That's really important. S for study abroad context. This is about counter storytelling. It's about hearing from the students themselves about their experiences and who they are. And as we've heard actually in the awards that were given earlier in this presentation. So that's important. C, capability approach, uses relevant tools to increase access, participation, and more inclusive practices. And this is also about getting their stakeholders together, including the students in that process, including their families in that process, to understand how can we make it better. H is highlighting the knowledge, skills, and the abilities of the students. So students bring with them all kinds of skills, all kinds of experiences, and we need to tap into that to make it a better experience for them and for the programs. So my goal is, and this is in closing, is to, I would love to see this used more and more with other programs, and I'll just end it there, because I think it's an easy tool and it's something that can make a difference. So thank you everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris-Weedman, for sharing your study with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Allen Brown from Purdue University, Language and Cultural Exchange in the USA, and the chapter, Impediments to Fostering Interculturalism at Home, the Nation State, Social Power, and Cultural Representation in EFL Teaching Materials. Thank you, Doctor, for your 2 minutes remarks.
Okay, well, thank you. And hello, everyone. It's a privilege to have an opportunity to join the session today. And I'd like to especially thank Dr. Fraser and Dr. Nabista for putting together these sessions. It's a lot of work, and I think everyone recognizes that. About my research and the chapter in the volume, my area of research focus is English education in East Asia. And my work that I'm talking about today is an outgrowth of that focus. One issue of great concern is inequity in access to English education, and that English education in places like East Asia is becoming a mechanism for the reproduction of social inequality. More affluent students are privy to more supplemental forms of English education. And in fact, there's an entire industry that has grown up around this. One aspect of this is that lower resource English learners have less mobility. And several of the speakers this morning have alluded to or spoken about this particular issue. Now, this mobility question is important because those with more resources can study abroad in English-speaking locales for such activities as summer programs or high school or college university experiences. Those with lower resources have less of these opportunities, less chance to engage in these activities, and therefore they must rely more heavily or even exclusively on the classroom for their language learning. Now, one important area for language learning is culture. And it's clear that the immersion of living in another country provides many opportunities to learn culture. So in light of what I've laid out here in my research, I was interested in the cultural learning experiences of the less mobile student. So to address this issue, I considered the way that culture is taught in the local classroom. To do this, I collected 2,000 teaching materials from elementary, middle school, and high schools across Japan. I conducted a content analysis to understand how culture was taught in these materials, both explicitly as well as implicitly and unintentionally. This research resulted in 3 findings. First, there were many problems with portrayals of the nature of culture. Culture was mostly portrayed in these materials as things, or so-called big C culture, rather than unwritten norms of behavior or frames through which we interpret our world. And of course, it's these unwritten norms of behavior and interpretive frames that most often give rise to culture shock. The second finding was that culture was consistently portrayed as homogeneous within countries. There was very little portrayal of cultural diversity within particular countries. thus creating the idea that each country essentially has one culture. And finally, the third finding was that in these materials, representations of powerful groups within powerful countries predominated. So, for example, there was a lot of representation of Europe. There was a lot of representation of the English-speaking countries, such as the United States. In terms of powerful group representation, one example would be that in visual depictions of people, thousands of visual depictions, there were only one or two pictures of individuals wearing hijab. Also, Christonormativity, there was a very large representation of Christianity, very little representation of other religions, so that a student exposed to these materials would come to the conclusion, perhaps, that everyone in the United States is a Christian. So overall, what I saw was very stereotypical portrayals of culture. Now, while the teaching of culture for the less mobile student seems problematic, therefore, I think the good news about this research is that these results do indicate or suggest some changes that could be made. So, for example, obviously, more diversity being represented within countries would be very easy to implement in cultural materials. And that concludes my remarks today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Xin Zhao from the University of Sheffield in the UK, and they will discuss their chapter, Home and Abroad, International Student Experiences and Graduate Employability. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Yeah, I'm Dr. Xin Zhao. You can call me Sky. I'm from the University of Sheffield Information School. So my research interest is in the internationalization of the higher education, particularly with the emphasis of student mobility and experiences at the various educational levels. So I guess I will briefly speak on behalf of our editorial team to introduce our upcoming book project. So as employability is becoming a key driver for international students to study abroad, so what we want is to gather perspectives of students and as well as faculty members to see how the study abroad experience impact on international students' employability, both at home and abroad. So our book aims to provide a holistic understanding of international student employability on a global scale. So incorporating research projects based in various higher education contexts, including the US, the UK, China, the Netherlands, Vietnam, and Japan. So it covers both the student employability within the curriculum in the host countries, as well as the continuous career enhancements for those choose to graduate and work in their home countries. So in this book, we select various types of papers, including qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, as well as reflective pieces. So we hope to launch this book after the summer. So that's the introduction of our book. So please do keep a lookout for our news. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we would like to introduce Dr. Max Crumley Effinger, who is from the Loyola University, Chicago in the USA. And the chapter is titled International Students at the Intersection of Local Policy and Global Emergency. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you very much. I did just want to quickly note that I haven't yet gotten my doctorate, but I'm working on my dissertation, and this research is related to that. So thank you for having me. In this chapter, I analyzed international student visa and study permit policies for degree-seeking students to see how policy responses to the pandemic were influenced by or tied to cultural, political, and economic discourses within Canada and the United States. So to do this, I first described how Canadian policies have recently emphasized the importance of international students as future highly skilled immigrants who can strengthen the country's economy, and that attracting those students requires a competitive spirit because other countries want to enroll them as well. The US international student policies, on the other hand, have often emphasized labor market protection and national security. So the chapter's findings show that despite the unprecedented nature of the pandemic, policy responses to the pandemic were tied to these same emphases in the respective countries. In Canada, these responses can be understood as support and adjustment scenarios with the purpose of easing the challenges of the pandemic through supportive systems, new flexibility in relation to restrictions, and more. An example of this is allowing students to count the time spent pursuing their studies online and outside of Canada towards their eligibility for post-graduation work permits. In the United States, while some flexibilities were introduced, the government also added additional reporting requirements for colleges and universities and pursued strict limitations on the number of courses students could take online. So I argue that this online enrollment limitation, while it was eventually rescinded, was in place for national security reasons so that the government had proof that students were where they reported they were within a country. So among other things, this study helps us better understand how policy is embedded in national political context, even as it responds to global emergencies. This sort of analysis provides new insights into the ways in which we might explore and eventually cautiously predict future policy responses to emergencies like pandemics, violent conflicts, and natural disasters. So one interesting question to come from this asks, how might emergencies such as the pandemic induce lasting reorientations of international student migration policy that can jolt national policy from prior paths? So this remains to be seen because the pandemic isn't over, but the policy changes explored in this chapter seem to represent not a disjuncture from prior ISM or international student policy orientations, but instead the incorporation of functional bureaucratic changes to maintain the overarching emphases and policy imperatives that were in place before the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Gazarian from Ashland University in the USA, and he will discuss his chapter, Employer Perceptions of Study Abroad, Subverting or Supporting Labor Market Inequality. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming and sharing your work. I'm Peter Gazarian from Ashland University. I'll speak briefly about a chapter I wrote related to employer perceptions of study abroad. And I was really interested in looking at existing literature to determine whether or not there are differences in the way in which study abroad functions within labor markets and how it influences the chances of individuals to achieve positive outcomes. And I suspected, just based on the work that I've done overseas, that it has a very different function in different contexts, but I didn't see much in the way of comparative research work that sought to document that. And so this chapter looks at the function of study abroad in the labor markets of East Asia, Europe, and then in North America to kind of compare the ways in which it influences outcomes for individuals. And the results revealed that it is extremely different even within regional, like global regions. So for example, in East Asia, there are some significant differences, but then in North America and in Europe, there are also differences. The key finding was that in certain locations, study abroad exacerbates existing labor market inequalities by limiting access to people to the most desired positions because it requires a huge amount of capital in order to participate in study abroad, and study abroad is considered a requirement to enter into those positions. Whereas in other places, study abroad actually created barriers for individuals who were returning to their home country, particularly, for example, in China or Japan or in the United Kingdom, where there was certain function of participation in local institutions that it increased the possibility of a positive outcome in that labor market, whether it be through a relationship between university and employers or through informal networks that were created through participation in higher ed. But yeah, I'll keep it there. If you're interested in any of this, check out the chapter, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gazarian, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we'd like to introduce Camille Lusage, please excuse me, from the University of Information Technology and Management, Poland. And the chapter is titled International Scholars in Academic Semi-Peripheries, a Sign of Research Excellence or a Remedy for Staff Shortages. Thank you for your 2-minute remarks.
Thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to briefly describe this chapter, but let me start with telling you that normally I interview scholars. I do qualitative studies, but this one is somehow specific because it's purely quantitative. Because what we did was to analyze official statistics, public statistics regarding geographical distribution of international scholars in Poland to answer this question about the quality, about the impact of international scholars on Polish higher education system. And what we found is that unlike many Western studies from the US, from the UK, those international scholars coming to Poland are often based in smaller cities, in less prestigious institutions, in institutions ranked lower than the national average. So in general, it's disputable that those international scholars are always hyper-productive, as it is sometimes proposed in the Western papers. In Poland, there are other reasons for having those people in our system or for those people to come to Poland. Namely, we have a lot of universities in Poland, like 400 universities in 40 million countries. So that's a lot. And we need like skilled teachers and native speakers of many Western languages. So this is the reason why universities try to attract them. And this phenomenon, all in all, is marginal, I would say, because in Poland we have like 3,000 just 3,000 international scholars, which accounts for roughly 2.5% of the entire academic staff. So this study demonstrated that academic migration to semi-peripheries is very different from this brain circulation or brain drain, which can be traced in the US or in the UK. The reasons are different and the outcomes are different. And on the other hand, the motivations of those scholars are very different, but I don't have enough time to discuss that. Just let me conclude with one idea, because out of those 3,000 people, the dominant group were Ukrainians, even before the war. And nowadays, it's highly likely that more and more Ukrainians will come to Poland as a result of this brutal Russian invasion. So the picture has changed drastically since we made this paper, since you wrote this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille, for sharing your chapter with us. And now we will have the segment for discussion questions, and would like to pose this first question for speakers. And please feel free to post your questions for anyone on any of these topics in the chat, and we certainly like to include all dialogue for questions here. The first question is, how do you view the role of global student faculty mobility addressing the larger social structural issues and inequalities? And thank you for all speakers who wish to respond to this question.
Should we raise our hands, or should we just jump in, or go ahead?
Yeah, any order fine.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that the explosion in international student and faculty, well, not faculty as much, but in international student mobility is not really tied. It exacerbates structural inequalities because it is really an industry. It's profit driven, and as long as it remains a profit driven industry, it's going to exacerbate exacerbate inequalities because it is a way in which people can gain a competitive advantage in their labor markets by spending more money than their peers. And that doesn't always function in all labor markets, which is why we see greater participation among certain groups within the international student market. But largely speaking, I would argue that this is part of this kind of marketization of higher education, where we are a profit-driven industry and international students are a source of profit.
Thank you very much, Professor. Is there anyone else who would like to address that first question that we posed for discussion?
Okay, I just want to add something for this question. As for me, actually, global student faculty mobility is giving a play to the larger social structure issues and inequalities to some extent. In Canada, underlying activist pedagogies have been discussed, such as how the faculty relates to to international students, and how the university at large accommodates diversities, just like race and gender, and how academic staff can imagine the new possibilities regarding the anti-discriminatory curriculum to handle the challenges of the international students. So, and some universities just are examining the support services such as counseling to issue it is culturally sensitive and related to the international students. And also they just have some cross-cultural training, developing cross-racial empathies, considering gender and cultural differences. So I think my answer is positive. And, like faculty members can boost the deeper appreciation of the others' experience and their perspectives from different culture contexts. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your response. And is there anyone else who would like to address the first discussion question or have any other remark?
I see the one digital hand raised.
Oh, okay. Yes, please go ahead and speak.
Hi, this is Lena Bo. Sorry, I cannot have my video on right now. I'm from Syracuse University. I work with international students. So regarding the role of the mobility, the student faculty mobility on the inequity issue, those things, I highly recommend recently, I think that there's a book, Jason and Waters and Brooks. So there's a book, sorry, I forgot the exact name right now. So, and address the trend of the new student and faculty mobility. So I totally agree, for most Western countries, international recruitment is generally for profit. So, but it's not just the only reason, primary reason. However, we also need to look at the change of the trend, because in the past 10 years, many Asian countries, especially China, has drawn lots of international students from low income or middle income countries, families. So those students, and so if without those, the new trend, without the new, like some initiatives of some Asian countries, they cannot study abroad. So, but I think the trend is changing. And then also, of course, Erasmus program definitely is another thing. So, and then make, lots of the middle class family, the students, they can study abroad. So I think that the new student and faculty mobility certainly is making changes in the social justice inequity issue. So, but it's still many new things, I think, popping up.
Thank you so much for your response. And now we'd like to move on to our second question. How does global student faculty mobility address intercultural education? global learning objectives for both domestic and international students and internationalization agendas. And in the interest of time, if we might have one person to give remarks or comments for this. Feel free to raise your hand. Thank you, Giorgio, please.
Yeah, I can go ahead with this, and I think it's just a broader perspective. I really like what has been said before. I think sometimes we think about student and staff mobility as something that exists per se, but what is important is the rationale why we are doing student and staff mobility. So it depends really what we want to achieve with that. If we're looking for global learning outcome, of course, student mobility, it's fundamental because you will expose students to different cultures, really moving to a completely different reality. You have learning outcomes that you cannot reproduce with other means, for instance, with collaborative international learning, even if this is a very good tool. So in that way, the ability of confront itself with different cultural experiences is fundamental. But we have to remember the second part of the question, which is absolutely important, that this should be for everybody. So how can we use the experience of international students and international staff to enrich also the experience for the local students? There are a lot of different methods that there are, like visiting professors that are showing their culture, but the key is really why we do that and what do we want to achieve with this internationalization. And the answer there is we should not limit ourselves thinking about student mobility or staff mobility per se, but we should think why we want to internationalize. So we want to internationalize because we want to improve the quality of education and research for all, and that we need something that goes beyond just the tool itself. We need a rethinking of the programs of curricula and really making them more intercultural, more international, and this is something that can happen also at home. So student mobility, staff mobility are just tools to achieve a final aim, which is really to have all students having global learning outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all who participated in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser. I do have a few housekeeping here, and part of the issue is, we published too many books over the pandemics, 15 new titles, and we tried our best to accommodate our colleagues and to share the, information from their chapters. So thank you so much. Still, I have some housekeeping here. We have several journals in our network. If you are thinking of publishing, let us know. These are the free of cost. There is no article processing fees or anything. These are open access journals sponsored by the public research universities in the US. We appreciate your submission in these the journals. We have 9 journals in the network. And also we have a partner collaboration with the Springer, Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan with the 3 publishing house, and the Star has also started publishing books. So this is also another venue for those scholars interested in writing and publishing their work. We have new titles, and some of you have already presented your chapters from these books, these volumes. Thank you very much. We have more books on community college, higher ed, international education, and teaching and learning and technology, a wide range of topics in education. Here on my screen, you can see some recent book published by Star Scholars. These are open access, so you can download at any time. As I said earlier, we published 15 books over the pandemics in 23 months. Then we have now the podcast series, a couple of podcast series run by Rajika Bhandari and our Oscar from Boston College. They are all about global student mobility, higher education, immigration, in a wide range of the cultures and other areas. And also we are starting a leadership series. Leadership series emphasize the role and mentoring from the department chair, dean or provost, and presidents. And Mary McConnor is the host of this session. Let us know if you have any other questions there. Then our next event is scheduled on May 18th in a similar format. It's on the theme of understanding institutional policies, resources, and technologies. And also I'd like to acknowledge the support of Morgan State University, American Council on Education, Star Scholars, and many other institutions, including Emerson, Appalachian, Michigan State, College of Canyons, Stony Brook, Old Dominion, Arkansas, CSU Northridge. Thank you so much for your time here. And on behalf of the Morgan State University School of Education and Urban Studies family, I thank all of you, all of our guests here, invited authors, editors, students, parents, for your time and excellent contribution. It could not be done without you. Thank you. And I hope to see you in our next event on May 18th. Thank you again. Have a great day.